The people of Africa join the rest of the world every year to mark the International Quds Day to express solidarity with the Palestinian people. This year, Quds Day rallies are restricted in most parts of the world due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, despite the COVID-19 pandemic restrictions, recently in South Africa, the ruling party's ANC Provincial Secretary Jacob Khawe organized a protest gathering in the country's capital, Pretoria, against the Israeli Apartheid regime. Let's take a listen.
Palestine, we love you. Palestine, we love you. Palestine, we love you. Palestine, we love you. Israel, you are a murderer. Israel, you are a murderer. Israel, you are apartheid. Israel, you are apartheid.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Africa Today, which is a special edition on the occasion of the International Quds Day. We shall be talking about Africa's support for the liberation of Palestine and Quds Day in Africa. And don't forget to send us your views as you watch our show today.
Africa's support for Palestine. The International Quds Day is a legacy of the late founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Imam Khomeini. Quds is the Arabic name for Jerusalem. Imam Khomeini designated the day in solidarity with Palestinians who have been persecuted by the usurper Israeli regime for over 7 decades. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, the International Quds Day has been held worldwide on the last Friday of the holy Muslim fasting month of Ramadan. Supporters of the Palestinian liberation movement from across the world, regardless of race and religion, now recognize the International Quds Day as the day of condemning the apartheid regime of Israel and expressing solidarity with Palestinians.
African people have always strongly and passionately supported the Palestinian people and their right to self-determination. Palestinians recall the historic proclamation of the iconic anti-apartheid leader Nelson Mandela, who said, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." Now, over the years, African people have always stand out massively to mark the International Quds Day. Let's take a look at one of the Quds Day rallies previously in South Africa. For an incisive analysis on Africa's support for Palestine, we contacted Tiseto Magama, an activist and a former member of South African Parliament. He's also a senior board member and spokesperson of Africa for Palestine. We also have Bukangesa, a member of Kenya Palestine Solidarity Movement. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time. Let's start off with Mr. Magama in South Africa. Now, African countries have over many decades supported Palestine. What's the state of this support currently?
Well, of course, African countries remain committed to the Palestinian question. But of course, what we have also seen, at least for the past decade or so, and this actually started even before the advent of Trump in the US, that the US started exerting pressure on African leaders to take a step back on the Palestinian question. So that was merely intensified by Trump, and of course there was much more focus on the issue of African support for Palestine. And then of course you had a push from the side of the US, to get African countries to support Israel. And then on the agenda of the African Union, then came the question of Israel trying to get an observer member seat, which of course has hitherto been unsuccessful.
That's Tiseto Magama, an activist and a former member of South African Parliament.
Before the COVID-19 pandemic, many African people in countries such as Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, and South Africa held various protest marches or indoor gatherings to show of solidarity with Palestinians. These gatherings attracted both Muslims and non-Muslims in support of the liberation of Palestine.
But we must be very clear that the people of Palestine have every right to struggle for their dignity and their freedom. And we support support the struggle.
Now I'd like to ask Mr. Ngesa, how important is it for Africans to show solidarity with Palestinians, especially during the International Quds Day?
First of all, I would say that the Al-Quds International Day for the African people and same to the Palestinian people is a day to confront the arrogant powers, of the United States and the apartheid regime in Israel and also their Western allies. That's how the African people see the International Al-Quds Day.
Mr. Bukangesa, a member of Kenya-Palestine Solidarity Movement.
Muslims in Nigeria hold some of the largest rallies marking the International Quds Day amid brutal crackdown by security forces in the country. Nigeria's top Muslim cleric Sheikh Ibrahim al-Zakzaki, the leader of the Islamic movement in Nigeria, has been in detention since late 2015. He played a major role in popularizing Quds Day in the country. Even during his incarceration, Muslims continue to heed his call and turn out in large numbers during Quds Day rallies. This is one such rally in 2018.
Now, Mr. Ngesa, over the years, many African cities have witnessed rallies and events marking the International Quds Day. Now, is the anti-Zionist movement growing in Africa?
Now, from the interpretation of my long involvement of anti-Zionist movement in Africa and global, I can see that the popularity of the rallies to support the Palestinian struggle has been moving from strength to strength, because certain divisive campaigns that have been, bringing down the solidarity has since been defeated. In fact, in the last 7 years, the scaling up of anti-Zionist movement in Africa has been commendable, especially being driven by the political parties of the left and even the progressive human rights organization and global citizens of the world.
Following on from last year's successful campaign for Quds Day, and in spite of the continued challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this year's Quds Day will once again be a global Fly the Flag campaign in many countries. During this campaign, freedom-seeking people from around the world raise the flag for Palestine on the days leading to the Quds Day.
Mr. Ngesa, this year, just like last year, there will be few or no public rallies on Quds Day. Now, what online activities are being held there in Kenya to keep alive this movement for the support of Palestine?
In Kenya, as the founding, member of Kenya Palestinian Solidarity Committee and even Kenyans for Palestine here in Kenya, we will be escalating a few online and offline activities to highlight the Al-Quds Day. And the most important one is the BDS movement. And we have already rolled out the first newsletter to highlight why we should not be supporting a regime profiting from war. We should not, supporting the African people should disassociate themselves from the regime that is profiting from occupying and subjugating other people.
Now, Mr. Ngesa there talked about the boycott, divestment and sanctions, popularly known as the BDS. Now, this is a movement that works to end international support for Israeli regime's oppression of Palestinians. Mandla Mandela, the grandson of Nelson Mandela, elaborates here on the importance of the BDS movement.
Let me say it loud and clear, ladies and gentlemen, for all to hear. Next to the internal popular protest movement waged in the face of all odds by the brave and courageous children, women and men of occupied Palestine, BDS is the most painful thorn in the side of apartheid Israel.
Now, Mr. Magama, how successful is the movement to boycott the Israeli regime in Africa?
I think the work that is being done is commendable. There's still a lot more work that needs to be done. As I alluded to earlier, we need to build that broad constellation of forces. There's still a lot of potential, to spread BDS across the continent and, of course, other continents as well. Latin America, Asia itself, the larger Asia, and so on and so on. So I'm saying to you that instead of looking at its successes, I think perhaps one specific success that I want to highlight, having spoken about Quds Day a moment ago, is to say one of the things it has done, it is to sensitize people around the plight of the Palestinian people, such that you now have many more people aware of what is happening, and it has effectively, or is indeed effectively, countering Israeli and US propaganda.
Dr. Ramzi Barod, Palestinian author, journalist, and academic, visited Kenya to launch his new book, The Last Earth, A Palestinian Story. Now, speaking to a local TV station there, he attempted to elaborate on the commonalities between Palestinian and the Kenyan struggle for independence. Now, let's take a listen.
Frankly, and maybe I'm being a little bit too bold with this statement, but I believe that if you do not support the Palestinian people, you are betraying the very legacy of your own anti-colonial struggle in this country. Mm-hmm. You have, there are certain parts of your history. If I take that text or that passage describing these parts of your history, and I take the certain terminology out and replace it with Palestinians, it would read as if you are reading Palestinian history. It's one and the same.
Now, Mr. Ngesa, what are some of the commonalities between Africa and Palestine in terms of struggle against colonialism and occupation?
Have a common history with history of colonialism. They also have a history of occupation. They have a history of subjugation. So in that way, then there is a lot of common aspects between the Palestinian struggle and the struggle of the African people. Remember that in Kenya, when we have the British colonialists here, the Kenyan masses had to come together and fight against the British colonization and also to free their prisoners. In that way, we see a lot of common, historical facts around the struggle for the Palestinian statehood and the struggle of the African people, or even the people or the colonized people of the world.
Now, Mr. Magama, we have had Mr. Ngesa talking about the commonalities between African and Palestinian struggle against colonialism. Now, I understand you have visited the occupied territories and you had first-hand experience with Israeli brutality. Now, how will you compare the current Israeli apartheid regime and South Africa during the apartheid regime?
You see, there is a deliberate conflation of what we say when we say that Israeli apartheid shares some similarities to South African apartheid. But by saying that, we are merely talking about the similarities. But it is in many respects much, much worse than it was under this brutal apartheid settler colonial regime that we faced in South Africa. So that should not be mistaken or misconstrued. It is indeed the experience of many of us, of those who've had the opportunity to visit the occupied Palestinian territories, and that is why the Israeli regime goes also out of its way to prevent people to visit the occupied Palestinian territories. I know I've had that experience myself when leading a committee of parliament. We were simply denied entry to Gaza.
After the 1993 Oslo Accord, Palestinian authorities, led by the PLO, decreased their active engagement with Africa. Instead, they endlessly turned towards the goodwill of the West, hoping that the very colonial powers that had primarily created, sustained, and armed Israel would miraculously become more balanced and humane.
Now, Mr. Magama, how did the Oslo agreements and normalization of ties with the Israeli regime impact on the support of African states for Palestine?
You know that the struggle is not over. There's still a lot more work that needs to be done. And that indeed we have to intensify, the struggle against this brutal, settler colonial regime and bring a decisive end to the Palestinian question. But having said that, I think one of the negative consequences, to speak directly to your question, was that there was that sense that, okay, at least now we are seeing the end of the road. But I think everybody has now woken up to the realization that this has been a farce all along, and that Israel had no such intentions, in spite of the best attempts of Palestinians, to implement the stipulations of the Oslo Accord. Israel had no intentions of making good on its promises.
Now, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we shall talk about how some African countries are being forced to normalize ties with the Israeli regime. Don't go away.
Africa's support for Palestine.
Last year, Sudan's transitional government was arm-twisted by the U.S. into normalizing ties with the Israeli regime and abandoning its traditional support for Palestine. Morocco also agreed to normalize ties with the Israeli regime in a deal brokered by the U.S. Now, in return, Washington agreed to recognize Morocco's sovereignty over the Western Sahara. African people have come out to oppose their government's normalization of ties with the Israeli regime. In Sudan, angry protesters set ablaze Israeli flags to protest the country's normalization with the Israeli regime.
The Israeli regime has been using unconventional means to extend its influence in Africa and undermine the continent's support for Palestine. Can the Israeli regime diminish the historical support of Africans for Palestine?
These moves by the Israeli regime towards the African people, they can convince only a few corrupt governments in Africa. And they can also convince a few corrupt politicians in Africa. But the people-to-people love between the Palestinian people and the African people, it's something that they cannot wish away, because you cannot, erase the historical commonalities between the African continent and the Palestinian people. So we will want to, just let the people of Africa know that however much, just like, the brutal colonization of the African continent took about 300 to 500 years on sometimes, and even slavery took 500 years.
Now, Mr. Magama, what's your take on the recent attempts to arm-twist some African countries into normalizing ties with the Israeli regime?
We see that there are attempts, of course, by both Washington and Israel in coordination with each other to break down any resistance from our sister countries, from the government, at least on the governments of our sister countries. Now, they might score a small diplomatic victory here, get Netanyahu to, extend his bloody hand to one or the other African leader. But in the main, you should perhaps, one of the barometers we should use is to ask the question, in spite of what seems to be a successful diplomatic effort, why has Israel consistently failed in the past 7 years or so to get the African Union to accept its member status in the African Union? It is because whilst there are these centrifugal forces, that are playing themselves out, or that are, pushing and pulling African leaders themselves know that their populations are not, in support of this. Their populations want to see a free Palestine, as free as those African countries themselves.
What's the link between the reform of the United Nations and achieving justice for the Palestinians?
From, the behavior of especially the Western members of the Permanent Five, France, the US, and UK, that they have absolutely no interest in reforming the United Nations. So because for us it's crucial, the UN has to be democratized. I mean, its most senior, its premier decision-making structure, the Security Council, is perhaps amongst the most undemocratic structures that exist. And so a non-resolution of the reform, or their inability to reform the United Nations, keeps matters such as Palestine forever on the agenda of the United Nations.
Despite pressure from the Israeli regime, Africa continues to officially support Palestine. Last February, African leaders reaffirmed in their 34th African Union Summit held virtually that all Israeli regime settlements erected on the occupied Palestinian territories and the Syrian Golan are illegal. During the two-day summit, African leaders stressed that Israeli regime settlements constitute serious violations of international humanitarian law and relevant United Nations resolutions. They also noted that these settlement activities are in defiance of the international community, which demands that they should immediately be halted.
Mr. Ngesa, you get the last word. Now, the African Union has been passing resolutions in support of Palestine. Are these resolutions enough, or more tangible action needs to be taken?
The African people, we cannot stop at just talking about the issue of Palestinian statehood, or even African Union. They have been passing resolutions against the fascist regime of Israel, or the United Nations passing resolutions. Those are good things, but to pass those resolutions are not enough. They have to move from rhetoric to material support, especially those who are able to support the Palestinian struggle, materially.
Well, thank you very much there, Mr. Bukangesa, a member of Kenya Palestine Solidarity Movement, and Mr. Tiseto Magama, a spokesperson of the South African-based Africa for Palestine movement. It's been great having both of you, and we all look forward to the liberation of Palestine in the near future. That's it for this edition of Africa Today. Now drop us a line through our social media pages and share with us your views on today's show. On behalf of my colleagues here, thanks a lot for watching and goodbye for now.